Today I want to talk about the relationship between collective action problems and public goods. So, it's often said the government should provide public goods, but what exactly does that mean? Now, as it turns out, public goods are the result of solving a collective action problem. Public goods are generally underprovided by the free market because producers cannot find a way to exclude free riders from the benefits of such goods. A very obvious example of a public good would be fireworks. Okay, fireworks. When you provide fireworks, um, anybody within a certain geographical range can see it. Often fireworks are, they're always at night, and you can see them from far away. So you can enjoy fireworks from just about anywhere, which means that it's very difficult for people who provide fireworks to make people who enjoy fireworks, the people who watch fireworks, pay for them, right? Because you would have to, in essence, find a way to block people off from several square miles of space, and typically in cities and other places where fireworks occur, that's just not possible. A small exception might be places like Disneyland, although I suspect one can see the fireworks from Disneyland and Disney World from outside Disneyland and Disney World. Anyhow, um, it's hard to exclude free riders from enjoying the benefits of goods and not paying for the goods. And fireworks, therefore, do fit pretty well under the category of a public good. It's worth noting that another word for collective action problem is simply the free rider problem. Now, public goods have two central characteristics. In addition to the non-excludability criteria, um, that is to say, providers of the good, like providers of fireworks, are unable to exclude free riders from enjoying the goods. Um, Another criteria is added to be a pure public good, which is that the goods have to be also something called non-rival. What does that mean? Well, that simply means that my enjoying the good doesn't diminish your enjoying the good. So in the case of fireworks, my watching the fireworks, generally speaking, does not make you enjoy the fireworks any less or make you any less able to enjoy the fireworks. Now, we can always come up with examples where, a tall person is standing in front of a short person, but generally speaking, in the purest public goods case, uh, my enjoyment does not diminish your enjoyment of the good. I can consume the good, and you can consume the good, and without interrupting your consumption of the good. Um, Now you might think, well, does anything really work this way? Well, uh, you know, fireworks, obviously. I think national defense comes pretty close. Certainly, things like clean air probably come pretty close, as do things like language, for example, or even the legal system or deterrence. So, without going into depth to all these examples, there are certain special kinds of goods, and we call them public goods, that at least come close to this definition of non-rival and non-excludable. That is to say, one person's use of the good doesn't diminish another person's use of the good, and providers of the good are unable or find it very difficult to exclude free riders. Now, most public goods, whether provided by the government or not, only approximate this definition. That is to say, they're not pure public goods, but they're close enough that it's thought that the market tends to seriously underprovide these goods. Again, because of the reason we just mentioned, which is that private producers have a really hard time excluding people who don't pay for the good, and so when they produce the good, uh, it turns out that lots of people are not paying for it, and so they're not going to produce as much of the good as people really want. Okay. Now, immediately I have to put a caveat or a rider on this definition in the sense that often when people in the media or in casual conversation are talking about public goods, sometimes they slip into this false definition of public goods, which is something like any good that would be beneficial if the public had it, right? Or any good that would be beneficial to the public if provided by government. And that's not the technical political science or economics definition of public good. And so I would like you guys to both be aware that the terminology is used differently in different contexts, but also be aware that when we're having public policy discussions about what goods the government should provide versus what goods the markets are capable of providing, there are very good, sound technical reasons due to the characteristics of public goods why markets do not supply them very well uh, or tend to undersupply them. Um, so public goods, the way I'm going to be using the term, are defined by their special characteristics, their non-rivalry and their non-excludability, and those are the two conditions I want you to have memorized. Um, they are different from private goods, which, of course, the public also benefits from. So, for instance, if the government were to distribute free bread or free Ferraris or, free healthcare for that matter, all of these things might be very beneficial to the public and yet not be public goods. Why? Because generally speaking, a doctor can exclude you from enjoying his services when he's providing consultations. Generally speaking, if I consume a loaf of bread, you can't consume that same loaf of bread. It's very easy for the baker to exclude you from the loaf of bread, and the loaf of bread is very much a rival sort of good, which means that generally speaking, the shelves that stock bread are typically not empty, and because producers find it very profitable to, sell bread. Unlike private producers of fireworks, which really don't exist. If you think about how fireworks are financed, it's always city governments or national governments that finance fireworks, with very small exceptions like Disneyland, Disney World, places where enough people have paid to get in that it's worth putting on the fireworks show. But typically that's not going to be the case. Disneyland can exclude people, free riders, from entering Disneyland, but again, it's more the exception than the rule. Okay, so the key here is that in the case of a private good, the private cost of the consumer of consuming the good is roughly equal to the social cost of the good being produced. That is to say, you are basically not externalizing the cost of your consumption on someone else, and you're not paying for something that you're getting. So all of these things, differentiate public goods from private goods. So we said the public goods are produced in response to a collective action problem. Well, if you think about the relationship, everybody would like the goods to be provided at a given price, and everybody is totally willing to pay for it, and that's key to something being a public good. It's something that there's a demand for. People would be willing to pay for it, but private producers can't collect money from enough volunteers to make it worth their while to provide the public good, right? So if we think about why there's no private cleanup of the environment, why we don't see private provision of national defense. Again, all of these things aren't provided privately because it turns out that if I live within a geographic area, I am protected by the army of my country, regardless of whether I pay for it. And so, generally speaking, armies are are paid for through compulsory taxation. You make people pay for it. Just like fireworks, the people of the city are made through local taxes to pay for the fireworks. Again, you can't get enough volunteers. So public goods, again, are this response to a free rider problem, or are produced and financed in a compulsory way as a response to a collective action problem. So, remember, the characteristics of the good are such that if it's provided to all, or if it's provided at all, no one can be excluded from enjoying it. This means that a lot of people will refuse to pay for it if they think they can enjoy it anyway at the expense of others. But of course, if not enough people pay for it, then no one will provide it, or at least provide it in the quantities that people want. So, just to quote Ilya Somin on this, who is a constitutional law scholar, a collective action problem arises when members of a group want a good but have little or no incentive to contribute to its production because they can instead try to free ride on the efforts of others. Now, technically, collective action problems occur when individuals fail to supply a good that doesn't exist right now. The tragedy of the commons arises when individuals overuse a good that currently exists, but the logic is the same in all cases. The public good is not produced or sustained without help. The free, voluntary actions of individuals is not sufficient to produce the good. Some kind of coordination, some kind of coercion, indeed, although the degree to which it's coercion to the extent that it's giving people assurances that others will also chip in for their fair share of goods that they want to enjoy. The reason that we don't try to pay for fireworks on our own is because other people aren't going to contribute unless we contribute, and that assurance is what laws and public financing can provide. Okay, what are some modern examples of public goods? Well, national defense, our police protection, enforcement of market transactions in general, so the legal system and courts, pollution cleanup, traffic congestion. Interestingly enough, steroids in baseball, or lack of steroids in baseball, sexual promiscuity, like another interesting one, negative or positive advertising. There are examples also that come from our Constitution in the sense that the Constitution was designed to solve some of these collective action problems by creating and mandating the provision of certain public goods, including the Postal Service, free trade between the states, the non-impairment of contracts, domestic peace and tranquility, as well as a stable currency. All of these are in the Constitution, and all of these all have aspects of public good. Having a stable currency system is a kind of public good. My enjoyment of the price stability, lack of inflation of the currency, doesn't impair your enjoyment. On the other hand, it's hard to make individuals pay for the money that they use, because money can be transferred to other people who presumably haven't paid for it. So again, public provision of a currency system seems to work fairly well, although you can see private provision in the case of free banking systems. Again, you go on down the line, you just apply the criteria. You'll find a case where the good is non-rival, one person's enjoyment does not diminish anybody else's enjoyment, and non-excludable, it's very hard to make individual users pay for the amount of the good that they use. One example that I want to talk about in this lecture has to do with democracy, and has to do with elections, and it has to do with voting well. Now, I think we all understand intuitively, in some sense, that democracy is the public good. But why is the public good? Well, think about it. We all have to pay for the costs of our collective decisions, but none of us individually controls how other people vote or participate in the system, and our contribution makes no real significant contribution to the outcome. That is to say, if I don't show up to vote, the outcome of the election does not change. The person who's going to win still wins, the person who's going to lose still loses, and that's true for every individual. So an election is a huge collective action problem, right? If everyone votes well, we elect good candidates, and we all benefit from that. And if everyone votes badly, we elect bad candidates, and we all suffer. But if you, particularly as an individual, vote well or badly, does the outcome change? And of course, you know that the answer is no. Your vote doesn't change anything to the outcome. And yet, that's all that you can control. You can only control what your vote is. So we are all at the mercy of everyone else in a democracy. Now, if your vote doesn't matter much, the best strategy for you is to put a fairly small amount of effort into it. Why put a lot of effort in something that does nothing? We don't like to put a lot of effort into things that we think are pointless. And of course, I'm not saying that voting is pointless. I'm just saying that to the extent that our vote makes no causal difference as to the outcome of the election, it doesn't change anything, our individual vote doesn't change anything, then why should you put a whole lot of thought into it? Even when you decide that you're going to do it, you might not put as much research as would be socially efficient. In other words, the private cost of you to voting well is higher than the social cost of voting well. We would all be better off if everybody put a little bit more time and effort, but nobody has a particular incentive to do so. And so voting well is underprovided, and good governance, which is the product of voting well, is therefore undersupplied in a pure democracy. right? We can model this as a kind of prisoner's dilemma, if you like. Again, it's a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, but we can imagine that everybody is symmetrically situated here. Voting poorly always beats voting well. If you just read this table for a second, you can see, for example, that if everybody else votes poorly and I vote well, then I incur a lot of costs and get no benefits. So, what should I do? Well, I've got no incentive to vote well. Might as well vote poorly, and I'll get bad government, but at least I don't have to incur the costs of all the research that would go into voting well. Okay, what about if everybody else votes well? Well, if everybody else votes well, then I should still vote poorly. Why? Because I'm going to get the benefit of everybody voting well anyway. So why not get it and not have to pay the cost? Ah, so it looks like no matter what everybody else in the world or everybody else in my democracy does, I should probably vote poorly. I am better off if I vote poorly. Okay, but the problem is, of course, is that from a social perspective, that if everybody does that and if everybody reasons this way, then everybody votes poorly, and we get to an outcome where everybody votes poorly that is worse than the outcome that would happen when everybody would vote well. Just as a reminder, and you probably know this from past weeks where we've looked at these different choice matrices, but 1 here is favorite outcome, 4 is worst possible outcome. We read the table from left to right, so the horizontal person is the number listed first, and we can read which outcomes are best for the group by simply adding the numbers together and seeing which one's the lowest. So vote well is the best outcome for the group because it has a total payoff of 4. We know that 1 is the best. So we know that the lowest number is better, so 4 is better than 5 in 2 of the other boxes and 6 in the vote poorly box. And yet, as we know, no matter what everybody else does, if I am rationally self-interested, I should vote poorly. But of course, this is another one of these classic situations where what's good for me to do, given what everybody else is, or given that I have no control over what everybody else is going to do, is not the same thing as what would be good for all of us to do if we could all coordinate our behavior together. Okay, so, I already discussed this, but voters' preferences and the outcomes are going to be as follows. The best possible outcome for you as an individual is cheap, good policy. Other people paid the cost, you still got good policy. So you didn't pay any of the cost and you get all the benefit. That's the best for you. Second best is expensive good policy. Good policy is very valuable and you want it, and it's better than bad policy, but you'd rather not pay for the cost for it. But you're okay with paying the cost for it because at least you get good policy. So that's your second best option. And then the third best option is cheap bad policy. If you're going to get bad policy, you might as well not have to pay for it in the sense that you might as well not have to do all the research that goes into voting well, only for your vote to be overridden by a whole bunch of people who vote poorly. And finally, expensive bad policy is the worst possible outcome, right? You put all the effort in and you get bad policy anyway. So I'm explaining the order of the preferences here, and that makes sense from the individual's perspective. So the bottom line here, and again, this makes sense. In order for democracies to work well, we need people to participate well. We need people to do their part in producing a public good. That public good is good governance and good voting, well-informed, rational voting. However, for that to occur, voters have to overcome their free rider mentality. They would like to be able to free ride off of the good votes of everyone else without having to show up at the polls themselves or do any research if they do show up. So in order for people to vote well and overcome this free rider mentality, either they have to fool themselves in thinking their vote makes a difference. If I think my vote makes a difference when I show up to vote, then I will put a lot of time and effort because I'm thinking that I'm making a difference. Now, that's not true, but if I fool myself into believing that, then I'm going to behave as if it's true, and I'm actually going to make it true in some respects, or I'm actually going to solve the problem. I'm going to solve the free rider problem. Okay, but that's unlikely. And we know it's unlikely because we know that even on a good year in a presidential election these days, maybe 30 to 35% of registered voters are actually going to stay home, and a fairly significant portion of the people who do show up have some pretty interesting views, to say the least, and probably don't really know who it is they're voting for or what they stand for in some cases. Okay, here's another route to solving the problem. Maybe people have to internalize democratic values in some ways. That is to say, just because voting doesn't make a difference doesn't mean voting is not a good thing and you shouldn't vote. It just means that you should vote for other reasons than it makes a difference. You should vote because perhaps it gives you civic pride, or you like to participate, or you like to do your part in providing the public good. You enjoy doing your civic duty, perhaps. If all of those things are true, then the private cost of voting is no longer really a cost. In fact, it's a benefit. It's a good thing. So if we can manipulate people's preferences through education, public education, for example, or other kinds of manipulation, people will then think, oh, voting is a good thing. I enjoy voting, and then they will go vote because contributing now will be better than not contributing. Um, so the problem, of course, is that if you want to obtain good enough policy in a democracy, that means that it requires that voters are sufficiently rational and well informed to vote well. That is to say, to throw out politicians who produce bad policies and to keep in politicians or vote in politicians that are likely to keep on giving you good policies. But because people don't have a very good private incentive to become informed or be rational, again, why expend a lot of mental effort if there's very little payoff or if it makes no difference as an individual for you? So we know that most people will probably not put in the requisite work to vote well. So we suspect that the outcome is going to be suboptimal policies, less good policymaking than we could otherwise hope for if we were able to coordinate it, if we were able to give ourselves mutual assurances that we were each going to vote well. For those of you perusing the slides, I encourage you to look at this video by former colleague of mine, Jason Brennan, and think about some of the questions that he raises. And he, in particular, as a philosopher, is interested in whether you have a duty to vote well, or if you vote, or if it's just morally okay to just cast a ballot without thinking very hard about it. And he also suggests that in order to vote well, you have to engage in some mental discipline to overcome certain biases that you might have about politics and about the world in general. He also addresses the question of mandatory voting. Would mandatory voting solve the problem? Right. So one way, if we think that the problem is that not enough people vote, then of course forcing people to vote might solve the problem. Just like not enough people are going to pay for fireworks voluntarily, so we force them to contribute to the paying for fireworks. Maybe. Now, it's worth noting that getting rid of democracy is probably not on the table, right? So for all its flaws, other systems seem to perform worse than democracy on many metrics of public policy. Not always, not universally, but on average. However, there's nothing forbidden in a democracy for not using democracy in certain areas. There's plenty of areas of our lives, families, workplaces, and even in the bureaucracy of government where we don't use democracy to decide what to do, right? And so democracy is not a hegemonic value that has to be employed everywhere that it can be employed. A democracy is a tool that can be used when it's useful to use it, but it can also be rejected in places where it has no place or has no use. So if we've discovered areas of policy or areas of government where individuals have systematic low knowledge, right? So I can think of, I don't know, environmental risk analysis, right? Voters should probably not directly vote on, who gets to do environmental risk analysis because none of the voters know anything about environmental risk analysis. And so as a result, we probably shouldn't use democracy in areas where individuals have systematically low knowledge. It's totally consistent to use democracy to decide questions about, say, general levels of taxation and redistribution, and not use it when it comes to very technical questions about how to go about implementing public policies, right? So we want to think about, or at least this collective action dilemma, collective action problem, should make us think about when democracy is likely to perform well and when it's likely to perform more poorly. Now, at the end of the day, there's no question that democratic government in general involves having faith in the people in some sense. If you don't have faith in people, you probably aren't a very convinced Democrat. You have to have a faith that people are responsible enough to take the time to deliberate on issues of common concern and rational enough to change their mind when new evidence comes to light or when new information comes to light that is relevant. In fact, you have to assume that they're rational enough to seek out this information and be aware of this information when it comes up. Now, this is an attitude in a culture that governments don't have a whole lot of power to shape in general. But nonetheless, it has a really deep impact on how well democratic governments operate.